What's up, family, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you are all having a wonderfully productive day and that everything is just going well for you. Today we're going to have a conversation that's actually one of my subscribers asked me about in a previous live, and that was really on this idea of about W.B. Du Bois, because W.B. Du Bois did have quite a few controversial ideas, and because W.B. Du Bois actually was a an outspoken non-believer, atheist, skeptic, free thinker, and all of that jazz, I thought it really would be appropriate to have a conversation about him and some of his ideals on this channel. So I do hope you all get some value from this. I'm very passionate about Black history, history in particular, but Black history for sure. And when I typically use the term Black history, I say that instead of African American history, because there's this thing that people say. They say, "Oh, Black history is American history," and I'm like, "No, that's cute, and I do get the sentiment, and I even appreciate it, but that's not accurate. African American history is American history." Black history is much older and much longer, much complicated, much complex, and much more nuanced than American history. Black people didn't start existing in 1776. Our history predates America. So, again, while I get the sentiment of that, and again, I do appreciate it, it's not accurate, and unfortunately, it actually distracts people um, from the length and breadth of history that Black people are connected to, and that is somewhat unsettling, because it does cause a lot of turmoil in the Black community when it comes to historical issues, not really finding out how we fit in the narrative. So these conversations should help that. So before I jump in, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that alert notification bell, consider joining our community, either through Discord, through Patreon, or through the YouTube membership program. And of course, check out our merch. So W.B. Du Bois, for those of you who don't know, he was one of the founders of the NAACP. And he wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folks. And in this book, there is he platforms this idea called double consciousness. Some people may call it dual consciousness. And it's the idea that Black people sort of have to have two fields of vision at all times, that they must be conscious of how they view themselves, as well as being conscious of how the world views them. Double consciousness is the dual self-perception experienced by subordinated or colonized groups in an oppressive society. The term also referred to Du Bois's experience of reconciling his African heritage with an upbringing in a European-dominated society. He also coined double consciousness, defined as a sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Man, if that's not a good description of how marginalized groups are often viewed by the two major political parties in this country. One political party tends to view them with contempt, and the other political party tends to view them with pity, and I find neither to be really helpful. To pull a direct quote from Du Bois, he says, "One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strive, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face." And, to kind of highlight the prevalence of this ideal. Now, I will say on the offset that double consciousness and code switching are not absolutely the same thing. So I do want to make that clear. However, you can see how this idea of code switching is connected to this same concept of double consciousness, in the sense that I have to, or that people sometimes feel compelled to have to change themselves, to fit in a society, a group, or popular buzzwords in corporations is culture. So you don't fit the culture. Sorry, man. You are what's the word? You are qualified in every aspect for this position, but unfortunately, you're not a good culture fit, and that's how you tend to get this idea of code switching. Now, of course, another thing that feeds into code switching is well-intentioned parents who have had to deal with this double consciousness and this living with this sort of duality in this world, and trying to still maintain some type of upward mobility, who instilled, well-intentioned, might I add, instilled in their children that your blackness might be an affront or an offense to other folks. And so let's try to curb that as much as we could, which is, it was a lot easier to do that in Christian circles, because then you could do that under the guise of holiness or righteousness. And so it's not holy for you to have dreads or braids. It's not holy for you to have an earring or two earrings or all of those things. And so through Christianity, you're being taught these things are holiness. But I do remember coming into a part of my life where I begin to realize that some of the things that were being communicated to me as holiness were in all actuality just imitations of whiteness, you know. But and as you notice, when I talk about these things, I really do try not to talk about these things with any amount of virility, because I'm more interested in understanding, you know, how these things have been shaped and how we've come to this place. So if you notice in my conversations, I'm typically not looking for a villain, because reality is typically more complex than that. Um, but yeah, so I did want to kind of to throw that in there, because I know code switching is a buzzword. The problem with that buzzword, though, this idea of code switching, is that people will be accused of code switching by well-intentioned black folk um, if that person's lived existence looks differently than what is sometimes considered the statistical typical existence of other black folks. So if you're a black person who you naturally do not use ebonics, I do use ebonics, but if you are, I've known several who don't, but if you're a black person who naturally doesn't use ebonics, then someone could say, oh, you're code switching because you don't speak ebonics, and but it's only code switching for that person if they are deviating from how they normally speak. And this is the danger with ideologies like this, because what you do end up creating is actually a stereotype. So anybody who isn't conforming to your idea of blackness, you can accuse them, oh, see, you must be code switching. And then it's almost like the same thing Christians do, where they're telling you, no, you're code switching and you don't even know you code switching. And it's like, you know, unless you have the tools to determine that as an outcome, you can't just attach yourself to that, which is why I do have a problem with these kind of bandwagon ideologies that every time a new word is introduced into the zeitgeist, all of a sudden it becomes a bandwagon. Like when people realize that narcissist was a thing, all of a sudden everybody's a narcissist now, you know. And so I do want us to be careful about that. All right, so kind of continuing on. The first portion of Black Power, the politics of liberation, labeled White Power, which was by Kwame Ture, who I've talked about, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, and Charles Hamilton, provides evidence backing up the ideology of double consciousness in regards to Black people in the United States. Their book opens up by defining racism as the predication of decisions and policies on considerations of race for the purpose of subordinating a racial group and maintaining control over that group. And for sure, the only thing that I would add to that is, for the purpose of, is for the most part somewhat unnecessary. So we can have this, says provides evidence backing up the ideology of double consciousness in regards to Black people in the United States. The book opens up by defining racism as the predication of decisions and policies on considerations of race. To me, that would be a complete definition. Once you add to it for the purpose of subordinating a racial group and maintaining control over that group, you do add to it intent. And for someone who knows a little bit about employment law, especially when it comes to racial discrimination, intent is one of the hardest things to demonstrate. And I think one of the things that we do need to understand is that when it comes to racism, is that racism isn't an individual. It's not something that an individual um, can be. For the most part, racism is always systematic, and once we kind of understand that, what we need to understand is that racism then doesn't necessarily have it isn't always tied to a purpose, because once it becomes systematic, it's almost natural, but a better word for that is social. And so at that moment, many of the people who are participating in it are actually disconnected from any purpose of doing anything, because for them that's just the natural way. So for many people who participated in colonial racism and slavery, in their minds the purpose was not to subordinate a racial group. The purpose was, this is the way of the world. And I think, and the reason I highlight that nuance is it's not that important, but to me it's important because then it allows people who may not feel like they are racist to consider that, oh, I might be participating in a racist system. But once you attach this intent and this purpose, you overlook all of the people who are participating in racist systems without any intent or without any purpose. They're participating in these systems typically off of some form of traditionalism, in the sense of, well, this is just the way things have been, or this is just the way that people have that people have thought, or this is just the way that the world is. All right, so they go on to add that the subordinate group, Black people, must think of themselves in terms of the oppressive population, white. And again, this is kind of that journey that I went through a little bit prior to my deconstruction. So, individual racism and institutional racism both contribute to double consciousness. On an individual level, double consciousness is practiced with everyday interactions, and on an institutional level, it impacts how Black people function throughout society. So, my name is Darante LaMar Martin. Now, for whatever reason, that's not considered a European name, which I'm just going to be honest with you. When people start talking about European names, Asian names, African names, I guess I've seen so many names that shit doesn't mean anything to me, right? Because there are some weird ass names in Europe. There are some weird ass names in Asia. There are some weird ass names in Africa. There's weird ass names everywhere because names, for the most part, are weird. They're weird as fuck, okay? You look at a baby and you say, hey, this is what you're going to be called for the rest of your life. That shit is weird. All right. But the point is, my name is Darante LaMar. As a Black man in America, for whatever reason, white folks have a really, or have historically have had a really hard time trusting people with names that they wouldn't have thought of themselves. And so because of that, there was a period in my life that I felt that I had to change my name on my resume to even get considered for jobs. And so a nickname growing up was Ron. So for a long time, my name is Ron Martin. And then I tried, let's try Lamar, which is my middle name. Now I'm more of the point where if I have to change my name to get your attention, I don't want your fucking attention, you know. But that's just me. But these are some areas that definitely highlight these ideals of double consciousness and how you can see them in a lot of ways. I mean, to be honest, and if I can just let some of my Pan Africanism come out of here, to be honest, the issue of double consciousness has been a very pervasive issue in the Black community. And this is why, again, I say Black and not African American, because it doesn't just impact Black folks in America. This impacts Black folks everywhere that Black folks have been colonized by people who did not look like them. As a former pastor, this is also what you see even in the Bible, is that people who are subjugated tend to take on the images, cultures, and the ideologies of the people who subjugated them. And this creates quite a bit of dissonance and tension because we know that this relationship was never a willing relationship in the first place. So it creates some sense of almost like a Stockholm syndrome, and where you create and you, I mean, right now there is a global issue with Black people changing their skin, literally bleaching themselves, um, it's when you understand the dynamics of this, it's such a hard issue to tackle because here's the nuance. Number one, you do have to kind of identify the issue of self-hate that's there, that people, and Malcolm X of course did an excellent speech on this, who taught you to hate yourselves, but there's an issue of self-hate here. But then you have to even be careful with challenging that, because then there also is the issue of exercised autonomy, which means, yes, this practice likely stems from this idea of not liking your own skin because of the way the world has treated dark people. And man, like, I have to be clear about this. Everywhere that white people went and dark people were there, those dark people got hung, burned, and had their genitals cut off. Australia, Asia, Africa, South America, North America. Everywhere Europeans encountered dark people, this was the behavior that took place. But we can't just put it on Europeans, because Asians did the same thing and are still dealing with this now in places like the Los Negros Islands. So these are real issues, but we have to refrain from telling people how they should be, and that's ultimately the problem of double consciousness. Is it accurately highlights a sociological issue that is a result of historical subjugation, but unfortunately it sort of ignores, and this is something we still struggle with, it also ignores kind of freedom of choice, right? And so I talked about the skin bleaching, but then there's another thing that's very pervasive in the Black community that is not as controversial as the skin bleaching, but it's even more prevalent, and that is the overwhelming amount of our women who feel the need to perm their hair or wear wigs or wear weaves. Now, while yes, we do know that some of this comes out of this ideology to fit into a society that does not look like you and to be accepted by a society that does not look like you. So yes, some of this does come from that double consciousness, but you also have to be mindful of some of this comes from, I just like the way this looks. And so that is like, it's a very tight rope to walk. Um, and this is some of the controversy that's been around this conversation. It's really been hard for my community to have these conversations, because typically we go to one extreme or the other. We're on the side, well, nobody should be bleaching themselves or they self-hate, nobody should have perms or they self-hate, nobody should wear Nike or they self-hate. And it's just like, well, like, yes, we do have to understand this is a mixed bag. There is some self-hate in here, and we should do everything that we can to help people find that love for themselves. But we also do need to understand that there are people who could absolutely love themselves and still want to change themselves. Like, like I, like I'm trying to be very careful of not becoming, religiously tied to my ideals, so much so that we rob other people of their own sense of autonomy. So I know plenty of Black women who wear, weave or have perms in their hair, who absolutely love themselves. And at the same time, I do know plenty of Black women who have the perms and the wigs and who do that because they feel like if they walked outside with their natural hair, then the world would not receive them, which my wife has done a great job of demonstrating is not the case. I only, and it's not that it's not the case. It's just that you can evolve to not give a damn what anybody else thinks. and be healthy. I promise you. And if you're willing, I'll do everything I can to help you get there. And I don't think I'm just some type of genius or special when it comes to that. I get that from people like this, from W.B. Du Bois. I quote Frederick Douglass quite often. Who was a man who literally, fought his way out of slavery with the mindset of nobody rides my back unless I bend over and let them ride it. So when a slave master tried to whip Frederick Douglass tried to whip him back. That's me. I am he. I'm that one. That's why fear mongering doesn't really work for me. Fear mongering only works for people who are afraid and who will do nothing when bad things happen. Fear mongering doesn't work for people who will stand up no matter what the cost is. And I am very much that person. Google me. Um, so let's continue. So that's kind of WB Du Bois on double consciousness, and I hope I shared some nuance there. But I also want to talk about another major issue with WB Du Bois, and that was his conflict with Booker T. Washington. Which, mind you, he also ended up having a similar conflict with Marcus Garvey, which we may get into some of that. Okay, so Du Bois argues against Booker T. Washington's idea of focusing solely on industrial education for Black men. He advocates the addition of classical education to establish leaders and educators in the Black community. Now, the problem with this argument is that in this case, Du Bois was absolutely ignoring Booker T. Washington's complete argument, and we do the same thing till this day. For example, if I say that people who can need to know that they can and be given the tools and the skills to help them do what they can to make an impact on their own lives, somebody else is going to say, well, that sounds too much like having to pull yourself up by your own bootstrap. Now, what that person has just said is not an actual argument against anything that I just said. What they actually just said is, I don't like the way that sounds. But just because you don't like the way something sounds doesn't mean something isn't a truth. And typically, we get so triggered by anybody who's saying a plan that is different from ours, which I find to be absolutely childish, by the way, because how in the world would you expect that somebody else who has a completely different lived experience from you would have the exact same plan as you? And why would you demonize somebody for not having the same plan as you, when you know that if they have a different lived experience, they're obviously going to have different perspectives. And so, and this has been highly damaging in the Black community for sure, but obviously it's not restricted to the Black community. But the majority of our movements have been highly polarized in this way, where you felt like you were pressured into choosing one side or the other, whether it was Malcolm or Martin, whether it was Black power or Black suffering, whether it was Booker T. Washington or W.B. Du Bois, or whether it was W.B. Du Bois or Marcus Garvey. My community keeps getting pulled in so many different directions, and it's always the conservative side that's making like the demand that you can only be, one or the other. So he argues against Booker T. Washington's idea of focusing solely on industrial education for Black men. And that wasn't Booker T. Washington's idea. That was Booker T. Washington's focus. Booker T. Washington's focus was on industrial education, but it wasn't his sole focus. And so, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. Du Bois refers to the Atlanta Compromise as the most notable of Mr. Washington's career and the old attitude of adjustment and submission. And I have read the Atlanta Compromise, and that's not what it says. Du Bois claims that Washington wants Black people to give up three things: political power, insistence on civil rights, and higher education. He fears that if Black people concentrate all their energies on industrial education, the accumulation of wealth, and the conciliation of the South, this will lead to the disenfranchisement of the Negro, the legal creation of a distinct status of a civil inferiority for the Negro, and the steady withdrawal of aid from institutions for higher training of the Negro. By Washington focusing on common school and industrial training, he depreciates institutions of higher learning where teachers, professional men, and leaders are trained. Now the false dichotomy should be glaring here, right? And I highlighted this in my notes, and these are pulled directly from W.B. Du Bois's words. And my goal here is not to vilify Du Bois. I do have some ups and downs with him, but I have ups and downs with everybody. Literally everybody. I think out of all of the people that I kind of study, the two that I have the most common in, where we have, or it's like three. Well, no, it's just two. Because I have a lot in common with Malcolm, but I do have quite a few deviations from Malcolm. Number one, I'm not a Muslim. But it's John Henrik Clark and Kwame Ture for sure. But he says by Washington focusing on common school and industrial training, he depreciates institutions of higher learning. That is absolutely false. Okay? Nobody focusing on something different than you is depreciating what you're focusing on. And this is something that I really do try to drive in our Sunday sessions, because this is absolutely tearing us apart. We need to remember that both and is a possibility. And when you actually look at history, and that's the thing we actually have now. We have the luxury of hindsight. So we can look back and see who was right and who was wrong. And the truth of the matter is, W.B. Du Bois was wrong and right. And Booker T. Washington was just right. And I'm just going to say it that way, because Booker T. Washington never found a need to attack any of W.B. Du Bois's ideology. He spent his time actually doing the work. And when I say doing the work, what we got out of that work was Tuskegee. What we got out of W.B. Du Bois's work, and I'm gonna come back to this, was the NAACP, which he got fired from. I'm gonna come back to this. All right. Um, but a part of this friction between W.B. Du Bois and Washington, of course, is this idea of Washington, thinking that, or saying that, somebody needs to be focusing on common school and industrial training. Washington never had this view that he was against classical education or higher learning in any shape, form, or fashion. But Washington was definitely in the South, while W.B. Du Bois was formed by the North. And so Washington understood that, hey, many of these people down here, the Industrial Revolution didn't hit here the way that it hit up there. And so the people down here don't even have at this time, didn't have the wherewithal to even fully appreciate the classical education in the same way that people in the North did, because there had been so many other things that they had been robbed of through things like a Jim Crow era South. These are things that Du Bois was not yet acclimated to. But another thing that added friction to this idea was Du Bois had this concept of the talented tenth, which I'm not overwhelmingly against this idea. I think what happened with Du Bois's talented tenth is the same thing that happened to Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise, the Atlanta Composition speech, which ends up getting renamed as the Atlanta Compromise, is that both of these things got framed in a narrative by people who had agendas not to support other things that they had going on. But these things on paper were not as controversial as the polarization of these people made things become. So, but it was the talented tenth. It refers to 1 in 10 black men, should be persons. Obviously, this is from an older time, so there's some patriarchal language here. But 1 in 10 black men that have cultivated the ability to become leaders of the black community by acquiring a college education, writing books, and becoming directly involved in social change. That's obviously a very limited view of who can help, right? In the talented tenth, and that's how people took it. In the talented tenth, Du Bois argues that these college-educated African American men should sacrifice their personal interest and use their education to lead and better the black community. And I mean that is actually, like, he's not wrong here. The problem is just adding the problem is the implication that the only men who could change problem is the implication that the only people who could have impact was men, and then also that the only men who could have an impact were the college educated. But the idea that people in the community should sacrifice their personal interests and use their education to lead and better the black community, now that was actually necessary. And unfortunately, I want you to notice how the black church has really usurped this position and ideal while absolutely separating itself from classical education. So the Black church has absolutely adopted the ideology of the talented tenth, at least in practice, in the sense that the Black church is the place where we raise up leaders who sacrifice their personal lives to lead and to better the community. But unlike Du Bois, the Black church has absolutely separated itself from any form of classical education. And when I say that, I don't consider theology or Bible school to be classical education. Just pointing that out there. Because, education has to be connected to its utility. I'll come back to that later. Now, in his later life, and this is why, like, I'm a big fan of not judging anybody by the moment. So I know everybody has enemies and villains out there. I don't have any enemies or villains, so you're not going to get me on that bandwagon with you. I'm sorry. I don't think that's a healthy way to engage the world. Me being mad at people that I don't know because of shit that they said, it doesn't actually make me a healthy person, especially if I'm not in a position to do anything about it. So you're just not going to get me there with that. And it's also because I have a long history of ancestors who have did fucked up things and then done great things after that. And if they had just been locked, if we had just locked them into that moment of the time that they did the things that weren't that bright, then we would have never got the value that came after. So I think we likely need to realize that none of us are fucking perfect, and a lot of us are fucking horrible. But that's why we do the work. We do the work because we hope that we can all evolve, grow, and change into better versions of ourselves in whatever capacity that we can. And so that's where I stand. And Du Bois is a shining example of that. In his later life, Du Bois came to believe that leadership could arrive on many levels, and grassroots effort were also important to social change. And this is actually one of the problems I have with the Black intellectual community right now is that they literally kind of approach all the problems in the Black community as if they're going to be solved by the Black elite, and sure, that would be nice if all the Black rich people, just paid everybody's bills and did the damn thing. But that's typically not how change works, and that's where I kind of draw my line in the sand. Is like change doesn't work by you convincing other people to do shit. Change works by you getting involved. That's how change happens. And so, to me, anytime I hear people talking about social change and they're not talking about grassroots organizing or grassroots mobilizing, then at that moment I feel like this is just a fundraiser. Um, I could talk a lot about the Black Lives Matter movement here, but I'm going to leave that alone for now because I don't want to piss y'all off. But just to remind y'all, I'm Black, so I can say it. No, I'm just playing, but I do mean that shit though. But even if I wasn't Black, I would still say it. We should be able to say the things that are true, even if they're not popular. But so he did come to kind of realize that no, grassroots efforts are absolutely necessary, and no, we don't need a whole bunch of Harvard trained people to actually lead social change. His stepson, David Du Bois, tried to publicize those views, writing in 1972 that Dr. Du Bois' conviction that it's those who suffered most and have the least to lose that we should look to for our steadfast, dependable, and uncompromising leadership. And that was a huge paradigm shift for Dr. Du Bois. And please understand that by this time in 1972, he was no longer living in the United States. He was living in Ghana. He left the United States in 1961, I believe, if my memory serves me correct. But listen to that. It says that his conviction had now changed to that it is those who suffered most and have the least to lose that we should look to. You know, that was a beautiful change for him. And this is ultimately an ode to Marcus Garvey at this moment, which the feud between W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington was pretty bad, but the feud between W.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey was downright disgusting. It's one of those moments in African American history that I'm absolutely not proud of. And it's also one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of the NAACP. But if you want more reason for why I'm not a huge fan of the NAACP, let's look at the black community when the NAACP started, and let's look at the black community today. I measure things by results, not platitudes. So, and again, if you actually look at the history of the NAACP, they have been behind undermining more independent black organizations than any other organization in this country. And hey, I don't care if it's not popular. It's the fucking truth. Okay. Literally, the NAACP used W.E.B. Du Bois as a gun against Garvey, which W.B. Du Bois later admitted was a horrible mistake. And that's why I say this is ultimately an ode to Garvey, because one of the biggest problems that W.B. Du Bois had with Garvey is that Garvey did not come from the educated class. He was not a part of the elite. He did not go to any Ivy League school. Garvey's family was a part of the working class of Jamaica, and Garvey worked his way up. Um, he W.B. Du Bois now realized that Garvey's poverty and rejection by dominant society, which another part of W. Du Bois in his early years is that he was also a colorist. A lot of things that people misunderstand is that a lot of the black leaders who get promulgated in African American history, because you're looking at all those pictures in black and white, you don't realize that a lot of those people were really light skinned. You know, um, all of Booker T. Washington's pictures, he looks like a dark man, but Booker T. Washington is a mixed man, was a mixed man of mixed race. W.B. Du Bois was highly light as well, and he actually took offense and made several statements that were absolutely atrocious and disgusting about Garvey's complexion, about Garvey being a darker man, and absolutely correlated that with Garvey's, or what he perceived as Garvey's, lack of intelligence. These are real issues within our history, and the reason I'm so passionate about history is because I like to get it right, or at least as right as we can, so that we can actually learn from it, and not just be indoctrinated by it. But he realized that Garvey's poverty and rejection by dominant society actually ended up giving Garvey grit and determination that led him to achieve what he achieved, while both Booker and Du Bois had a type of trust in Americanism that ultimately betrayed them both bitterly. And there's a lot of controversy around the way Booker T. Washington died. It is believed by many, if not most, that he was actually poisoned, that he was actually assassinated. And there's I went to an event a few years ago where there was a book. I've got to find that book that was written by, I think it was one of the nurses that was working with him, and that was sharing some information along those lines. And ultimately, just to kind of give the conspiracy theory part, it was believed that this was that the churches of Alabama were in collaboration with some of the white power structures in Alabama who wanted to get rid of Booker T. Washington. And that's the conspiracy theory version of how that happened. But inevitably, Du Bois and Booker both made the same mistake, and that is they trusted that Americanism would be an ally. Garvey, because of his poverty and his complexion, understood that Americanism could never be a true ally, and he also understood that, or at least during those times, and he also understood that Negroes, that was the language used then, who thought that that the American government system would be an ally for Black people, had bought into it on these ideas of very color-based lines, and so he really did highlight how colorism was as big as a problem in the U.S. as it was in Jamaica, which W. Du Bois did try to claim that was not the case, that there were no color issues amongst Black people in the U.S. So, for all of us who actually know that is an issue now, please understand W.B. Du Bois, at the behest of the NAACP, were trying to convince people that no, Black people weren't dividing against themselves by color class. It was absolutely Marcus Garvey who brought that to the light and demonstrated that no, this is a real issue, that darker skinned Black people were being treated as if they had nothing to contribute to the conversation. Ooh, this is good stuff. All right, so and this is, this is so basically what you get here when you're looking at W.B. Du Bois and Garvey, and even W.B. Du Bois and Booker, is you have to understand that these are all men who all think they're doing the right thing and they're all trying their best to do the right thing. And I wish we'd begin to look at humanity that way. Like even people who are doing the wrong thing, in their minds, they don't think they're doing the wrong thing. They've somehow convinced themselves that this is the right thing to do. And we have to start understanding that if we ever hope to actually shift from polarizing each other and actually get to a place where we can start somehow balancing each other, which is definitely what they needed. And unfortunately the black community suffered the most, because these were all great people. Booker T. Washington was incredible. W.B. Du Bois was incredible. um, um, Marcus Garvey was absolutely incredible. The thing that made them absolutely weak is that they did not learn how to work together. And that's something that this community, that the black community definitely needs to understand to this day. Hear my words clearly. But not only just the black community, America needs to learn that. But not only America, humanity needs to learn that. Like we don't have to agree on everything to be able to work together. And ultimately, it kind of reminds me, which all of Black history does, or all of African American history does at least. It reminds me of Nino Brown and Scotty Appleton. You know, New Jack City. Nino Brown and Scotty Appleton are like, to me, like that movie was genius. And honestly, I don't like a lot of movies with high. I don't like movies with like realistic violence. If it's like fantastic violence, and I'm not using the word fantastic as in fun, but using the word fantastic as in more exaggerated stuff that's not really realistic, like somebody pulling somebody's head off. Oh, I can handle that all day. Saw Trap, I can handle that all day. And I know that that is realistic, but it's also fantastic. Um, there's not a Jigsaw out there that I know of. But movies like South Central, Shadas, and stuff like that, were it was just really gritty and it's just in the hood, because that was my life. Like I didn't need to see that shit on television. So, but New Jack City was very different for me because it was profound, polemic even, um, in a sense that it showed two black men and how they had both been shaped by America. And some people watch this, and again, New Jack City, Ice-T was Scotty Appleton, Wesley Snipes was Nino Brown. Um, and to me, that movie, oh, it just did a great job because you have Nino Brown, who is obviously supposed to be the villain. But again, like I don't see villains the way that other people do because I watched the whole story. Um, to me, both Nino Brown and Scotty Appleton are victims of colonization, and they both responded to it in different ways. Scotty has responded to it by becoming a part of the police force, becoming a part of the law enforcement, which is appropriate for this conversation because, in that sense, Scotty is somewhat wrestling with his dual consciousness, his double consciousness, his two-ness, realizing that the very institution he's a part of has played an oppressive role in his community, but he also realized that there are other roles in his community that can be just as dangerous, and he's wanted to put himself on the other side of that. And then while Nino Brown, what he determines is that poverty is the biggest enemy in his community, and he's determined that he's going to lead his community from poverty. And I mean, that's literally the narrative. I mean, the you can get confused because you say drug dealer trying to lead himself out of trying to lead his community out of poverty. But yes, we have to stop with these racial motifs where we're willing to say, oh yeah, mafias did a lot of good for their communities, but we can't see when black gangs have done the same thing. you know because yes, mafias did a lot of good for their communities, and they also did a lot of bad things for their communities. But guess what? So did fucking politicians. Like I don't so I don't be understanding these childish rabbit trails that we go down sometimes. But no, so these are both men who are trying to do things what they think is right for their community, and both of them are doing both good things and bad things, because it's Scotty who absolutely uses Pookie and gets Pookie killed. You know what I'm saying? So So the problem is, the point is, they are both a part of the problem and they are both a part of the solution. But because they have been so polarized, all they can see is each other as the problem. And neither one of them can see how each other also represents a part of the solution. That's just a nice summation of humanity altogether. All right. So Du Bois did come to see that Washington was not a conformist, but a realist. Washington's concern, much like Carver's, um, um, George Washington Carver, was that while voting and classical education were absolutely necessary, they had an understanding that many of the Negroes in the South were bound to sharecropping and had become subservient to Southern ideology, meaning that for many of them, the right to vote and classical education would ultimately only be used in the service of the oppressive class. Now, if you take a brief history of um, legislation in the South since the 20s, you'll realize that Booker T. Washington was absolutely right. That if you don't give these people an economic floor, an industrial foundation, a way to actually control their own life, then giving them the right to vote and us getting the right to vote and us getting and us getting a classical education is only going to be used to serve the class that sees themselves as superior, because the recent conditions and circumstances has resulted in a subservient ideology and mentality, you know, um, typically reinforced like by stuff like the death of Medgar Evers and Emmett Till. And so people tend to cope with these things by just, submitting. And so that this was Booker T. Washington's concern. They're going to vote the way these people tell them to vote, because these people are going to say, if you don't vote the way that I want you to vote, then you won't be sharecropping here anymore. Or or if I get a whiff that you're trying to vote for something that we don't want to see, we might drag your son out of bed in the middle of the night and kill him. And so you're giving these people power with no strength. And so it's just people who are stronger than them are going to take that power, which is what we saw happen after Reconstruction. Okay. Which is one of the things that I remind people about. Like, when it comes to the civil rights movements, there's so many nuances that people don't understand, and the narrative has been absolutely irresponsible. So no, the majority of Black people were not fighting for integration. This is, to me, this is one of the most irresponsible parts of that narrative altogether. What they were fighting for was to to get back the things that they had paid for. So when you see those images of Black water fountains and white water fountains, Black restrooms and white restrooms, Black schools and white schools, the context that you don't have there is that many of these things were put in place when Black people were in leadership for a short period of time during Reconstruction. And these were things that these communities, in allyship with other white people, I don't want to blackwash them out of that, but in allyship, surely, with other Black people and natives and all of those things. But they had gotten some really progressive things happening for the South, such as public education and all of these other things. And then after Reconstruction, they got pushed out of the communities they built. They got pushed out of the complexes that they built. They got pushed out of the schools that they built, and then got pushed into rundown stuff, you know? And even then, the cry wasn't, hey, we want to integrate. The cry was, we want our stuff back, you know? And every time Black people in this country ask for their rights, we always have to accept the booby prize. But that typically happens because of the real issues that Booker T. Washington was trying to highlight. Because what ended up happening is we got leaders who looked like us but weren't really capable of understanding the problems. And so therefore they did exactly what Booker T. Washington thought they would do, and that is they just took the advice of the established class on what they should do. But anyway, Booker's understanding was that if the community did not build up an economic floor for itself, wherewith to build the muscle to understand the needs of a nation, that it would be taken advantage of, even with a classical education. Du Bois did not have a good working relationship with Walter White, which was the president of the NAACP, and that conflict, combined with the financial stresses of the Great Depression, ended up resulting in a power struggle over the crisis, which was a publication that Du Bois had kind of founded. And then Du Bois, concerned that his position as editor would be eliminated, he resigned his job at the crisis and accepted an academic position at Atlanta University in around 1933. And this was actually a big turning point in W.B. Du Bois' ideology, because I want you to notice that the NAACP didn't become dismissive of Du Bois until after Booker T. Washington died and after Marcus Garvey was deported. Then all of a sudden, the NAACP, which had treated W.B. Du Bois as their shining boy, had treated him like that throughout the whole ordeal. But as soon as Garvey was deported, all of a sudden, the NAACP started treating Du Bois just like they treated Garvey. Because I think the subtle lie or illusion that W.B. Du Bois bought into was that they're going to make me Garvey, And what he didn't realize is, no, they're going to treat you like Garvey. I think what he thought, because I think what he was offended by is that Garvey, this uninitiated guy who comes from Jamaica, comes to the United States and builds the largest not even African American, builds the largest United Black organization in the world. Nothing has been seen like it since then. And I think that absolutely rubbed Du Bois the wrong way, because we are a competitive species. It's like, oh, dang, this dude just came in and ate my lunch. Garvey was buying steamboats. Garvey was starting doll shops to make black toys for kids. Garvey was doing it all. The biggest mistake that Garvey made was not having quality people around him. But that was because all of the quality people were against him, But anyway, so there was a rift at the NAACP. It grew larger in 1934 when Du Bois reversed his stance on segregation, stating that separate but equal was an acceptable goal for African Americans. That was 1934, ladies and gentlemen. I told you, there's a lot in the narrative where you think, no, everybody wanted this. This is what everybody wanted. And I'm like, you still ain't learned not to trust American media? We don't, no, we're not actually doing the real work of journalism in this country. And we haven't been doing it for a very long time. And in order to do the real work of journalism, you have to be concerned with the truth, not sensationalism. Journalism has been replaced by consumerism. And so we cater to what we think the consumer wants to hear, as opposed to getting the information out as is. And this has definitely impacted Black history in some severely significant ways, because we have gross misunderstandings now. So and now, if anybody actually tries to come up and voice these ideals, that no, there were quite a bit of Black people who were absolutely okay with being segregated, in the same way that fucking Canada is okay with being segregated from the United States. And so the innocuousness of this is that there were more Black people who wanted to be left the fuck alone and try to figure out how to govern themselves. And that's what we were robbed of. This country that went and took a piece of land from brown people to give it to people who had suffered a tragedy refused to give Black people in this country the same damn type of rights. And excuse me, but that shit pisses me off. We wanted the right to govern ourselves. We didn't want the right to be governed by you. What the fuck? That was the only right thing to do. The only right thing to do after you have stolen a people from their land and taken everything from them and put them out of business economically, the only fair thing to do, the only right thing to do is to let them go and to release them from you. I'm sorry, but that shit needs to be said. It's not right until it's right. And this is why I'm absolutely offended by every political party in this country, because none of them are willing to do what's right when it comes to my people. And I will not change what is right just to make you feel more comfortable about who your fucking candidate is. Right is right. And I don't care if it's a black person saying it, a white person is saying it, or anything else. This is the nuance of the history. This is why shit hasn't gotten better in the black community. But so Du Bois reversed his position because the truth of the matter is it was never his position. It was the NAACP's position. It was never his agenda. It was the NAACP's agenda. The NAACP leadership was stunned and asked him to retract his statement, but he refused, and he ended up being forced to resign from the NAACP. Now, not only did Du Bois end up having to resign from the NAACP, he also ended up becoming the victim of the J. Edgar Hoover FBI era. And I want just to kind of play this back. J. Edgar Hoover was allegedly involved with the assassination of Booker T. Washington, was involved with the deportation of Marcus Garvey, was involved in the exile of W.B. Du Bois and Maya Angelou. Okay? Both of these people moved to Ghana because they were being harassed and persecuted by the FBI. But J. Edgar Hoover's FBI is also responsible for the assassination of Fred Hampton. The J. Edgar Hoover FBI era is also responsible for the deaths of several students at Jacksonville State in Mississippi. J. Edgar Hoover was also responsible for the death of several Black Panthers, the assassination of Dr. King, the assassination of Malcolm X. Honestly, until I hear a political candidate that actually deals with this stuff, it's just more of the same. You know, I didn't mean to make this political, but I need you to understand why I don't trust this country, especially those of you who are my allies. Listen, allies, especially if you're Democrats. If after some of the stuff I've talked about, if you cannot respect the fact that I don't trust the Democratic Party and I don't trust the Republican Party, then you don't respect my lived experience and you don't respect my perspective. And that's the fucking problem in this country, because I can respect yours. I'm not telling anybody out there not to be a Democrat. I'm not telling anybody out there not to be a Republican. I'm trying to get everybody out there to start listening to each other, because the same shit we're doing now is the same shit that W.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey was doing to each other. It's the same shit that Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois was doing to each other. And it got us nowhere and cost us everything. We need to finally start learning these lessons. In 1953, The Souls of Black Folk was published in a special 15th anniversary Jubilee edition. In his introduction, Du Bois wrote that in 50 years since its publication, he occasionally had the inclination to revise the book, but ultimately decided to leave it as it was, as a monument to what I thought and felt in 1903. And to me, that was just one of the most beautiful things that W.B. Du Bois ever wrote, because in essence, what he's saying is, I don't want them to forget that I thought that way. I don't want anybody to forget that I said that. I don't want them to forget that I was wrong. I want them to remember that I said it loud, that I said it strong and that I was absolutely wrong. So I don't really know what the entire point of this video was. It's really just to give you a little bit of insight into W.B. Du Bois, a black atheist that people don't often talk about. And while this was somewhat of a deviation from, talking about him just as an atheist, it's really talking about how history impacts all of us and how we are all capable of learning from it. And hopefully, we can stop repeating stuff that's really unnecessary. And like where we are right now, it's unnecessary. We can do better, and I'm going to do my best to help us do better. That's my goal. If you're coming to this channel for anything other than people centric, progressive thinking, life affirming, I don't know what else to tell you. It's clearly advertised, And so that's who I am. I want us to do better. And I have no reason to think that doing better means we're all going to agree on the same things. I think that doing better means we need to learn how to disagree and to learn how when disagreements, when disagreements really don't matter, because there are a lot of things that we disagree about that don't matter that we fight about. And I'm like, how would you agreeing about this change anything? It doesn't. So why does you disagree? Does you disagree? Did disagreeing about any of this change anything? It's like you've given your agreement more power, your agreement and your disagreement more power than it actually has. Well, we agree. Well, if you don't agree that the world should be ran this way, then I don't want to be your friend. Are you running the world? Am I running the world? So how would this disagreement actually cause any issues? It doesn't. You're not in that position. I'm not in that position. You know. But in this those false dichotomies, the one that W.B. Du Bois recognized or used earlier in his life, to where, well, if Booker's not doing the thing that I'm doing, then Booker is my enemy. Booker's telling people they need industrial education. Why would he do that? But I'm like, do you realize how ridiculous it is to say that people should only have liberal education, liberal arts education? Like, what type of society do you have there if technology hasn't already caught up with a way to create that world? And so, like, there's nothing wrong with being able to say my focus is liberal education. Booker's focus is industrial education. Garvey's focus is commercial application. Why don't we just fuse it so we cover everybody? Otherwise, you're trying to enforce, and this is why Garvey ended up being the most effective out of all of them, and ultimately became the biggest threat. Because otherwise, you're only reaching people who agree with this one particular thing. You're limiting your numbers. Like, this is not good math. This is stupid shit. Don't do that. So let's not do bad math. Let's not do false dichotomies. Let's actually learn from our history, and let's actually put people over policies. I know it's hard, but we can do it. I believe in you. All right. So I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. That's all I got for now. I did not mean for this to be an hour. Yikes. I need a smoke break now. But this was fun. This was Saturday. I think I'm going to grill today. I know I got to get ready for Sunday sessions, which, it's going to be incredible. Tomorrow's conversation is the reasons why we feel. And of course, we're in this series called Change My Mind, where we're exploring neuroplasticity and the neuroscience of how mind change actually takes place. So if you don't have anything going on, 12 noon, join us on a Sunday. We have some really cool conversations, and that's what they are. They're conversations. We don't do lectures on Sundays. That's one of the things that really separates us from church communities, but not even just church communities, but even like educational communities, is that for us, it's not to pretend like we have all the right answers. And again, I'm incredibly averse to trying to be anybody's voice. That shit is brain wrecking. But it's really just having conversations as a community, because I do find that people tend to learn the most and get the most out of conversations that they can actually be involved in, engaged in, contribute to, and ask questions in. And so if you're looking, for ways to kind of grow and build with a community, that's an excellent way to check us out. All right, I'm done. I love y'all so much. If you haven't already, like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that alert notification bell, and consider joining our community either through Patreon, right here on YouTube, or of course through Discord. Find us, holla at us. And we also have some merch. It's pretty dope. Until next time, keep rising, stay progressive, and if you can, stay beautiful. I'll holla.